January 17th, 1940. Aberdeen Proving Ground, Maryland. The morning air is cold enough to sting. Frost clings to the steel frames of the testing range, and somewhere beyond the barracks, a steam whistle cuts through the silence. Inside a cinderblock building that smells of gun oil and burnt powder, a man named Major George Jarrett stands before a table scattered with steel fragments, photographs of shattered skulls, and a single dented helmet. British. Mark II pattern, painted the color of wet clay. He turns it over in his hands. The liner is soaked through with something dark. He sets it down gently, as though it were still attached to a head. Jarrett is not a sentimental man. He is an ordnance officer, a mechanical engineer by training, a problem solver by nature. But he knows what this helmet represents. It represents failure. Not moral failure, but material failure. The failure of steel to do what men need it to do, which is to turn away the storm. For 2 decades, the United States Army has relied on the model 1917 helmet, a shallow soup bowl design copied hastily from the British during the last war. It was never meant to last this long. It was never meant to be good. And now, with Europe burning again and American boys likely to follow, Jarrett and his team have been given a task as urgent as it is impossible. Design a helmet that can stop shrapnel at any angle. Not some angles. Any angle. They have 6 months. The story of the M1 helmet does not begin with steel. It begins with failure, with the knowledge, hard-earned and soaked in blood, that the human skull is shockingly fragile. During the First World War, head wounds accounted for nearly a quarter of all battlefield injuries among American troops. Of those, 70% were caused not by bullets, but by shell fragments, irregular shards of cast iron spinning through the air at velocities high enough to shatter bone, but too slow to pierce thick steel cleanly. The British learned this early. The French learned it at Verdun. The Germans learned it in the Somme. By 1916, every major army had adopted some form of steel helmet, and the results were immediate. French head injuries dropped by 30% within a year. British casualties fell even further, but the helmets themselves were crude. The French Adrian was elegant but weak, its segmented construction prone to splitting. The German Stahlhelm was superior in coverage, its extended skirt protecting the neck and ears, but it was heavy and expensive to manufacture. The British Brodie, adopted wholesale by the Americans in 1917, was cheap and simple. A wide-brimmed basin stamped from a single sheet of manganese steel. It looked like a pie tin. It worked, after a fashion. But it had one fatal flaw. Geometry. Shrapnel does not fall straight down. It comes from every direction, sideways, upward, tumbling through smoke and chaos. The Brodie's wide-brimmed deflected fragments approaching from above, but anything coming laterally struck the helmet's shallow dome at a near-perpendicular angle. And when metal hits metal at 90 degrees, it does not glance off. It penetrates. Reports from the front were consistent. Men struck in the temple, the ear, the back of the skull. The brim was useless there. The dome was too shallow. The Americans knew this. The British knew this. But there had been no time to redesign, no industrial capacity to retool, and so the Brodie remained standard issue, a compromise welded into doctrine, a helmet that saved thousands of lives and failed thousands more. By 1940, compromise was no longer acceptable. The new war demanded new standards. Jarrett's team knew the numbers. They knew the stories. They knew that if American soldiers were sent into this war wearing the same helmet their fathers had worn, men would die who did not have to. And so they began not with steel but with angles. The testing facility at Aberdeen is a place of controlled violence. It is where theories go to be destroyed. Jarrett's team constructs wooden frames fitted with ballistic gelatin, gray, translucent blocks, molded into the rough shape of a human torso and skull. They suspend helmets at varying heights, angles, orientations. Then they fire at them. Not bullets, shrapnel, irregular chunks of steel propelled by compressed air at velocities calibrated to match artillery fragments. 1,200 feet per second, 1,500, 1,800. Some tests use ball bearings. Others use jagged scrap metal salvaged from shell casings. The results are catalogued with photographic plates, calipers, and careful notation. What they learn is this: shape matters more than thickness. A helmet's ability to stop shrapnel depends less on the hardness of its steel than on the probability that a fragment will strike it at a deflecting angle. If the surface curves smoothly and steeply enough, even a relatively thin shell can turn aside a fragment traveling at lethal speed. But if the curve is too shallow, if the dome is flat, as in the Brody, then fragments strike head-on, transferring their full kinetic energy into the steel. Penetration becomes likely. Catastrophic deformation becomes certain. Jarrett sketches obsessively. His notebooks fill with geometric diagrams, parabolas, ellipsoids, hyperbolic curves. He studies the Stahlhelm, which the Germans have refined over 2 decades into something approaching perfection. Its steep, flared sides and extended rear skirt provide superior coverage, and its deep crown deflects fragments across a wider range of angles. But it is heavy, nearly 3 pounds, and its design is difficult to stamp efficiently. The Italians have attempted something similar with the M33, a helmet that looks like an inverted basin, elegant and streamlined. But it offers poor coverage at the temples, and its liner system is fragile. What Jarrett needs is a helmet that combines the best elements of all predecessors while eliminating their flaws. It must be light enough for sustained wear. It must be simple enough for mass production. It must protect the temples, the forehead, the back of the skull, and above all, it must present a steeply angled surface to fragments approaching from any vector. He calls it the T2. The prototype is ugly. It looks like a soup pot welded to a coal scuttle. But when they fire at it, the fragments skip off like stones on water. The engineering challenge is only half the problem. The other half is manufacturing. Steel is not infinite. In 1940, the American steel industry is still emerging from the Depression. Its furnaces running below capacity, its workforce demoralized. War production has not yet begun in earnest. There is no stockpile of manganese alloy sheet steel, no reserve of Hadfield steel or nickel chromium plate. If the Army orders a new helmet, it must be made from whatever steel is available, and it must be made in quantities that defy imagination. The U.S. Army numbers over 1 million men in 1940. By 1942, it will be 5 million. By 1945, over 8 million. Each man needs a helmet. Each helmet requires roughly 3 pounds of steel. That is 12 million pounds for the current force alone, 6,000 tons. And that is before accounting for replacements, for damaged helmets, for helmets lost in combat, or worn beyond serviceability. The production run will need to be at least 20 million units, possibly more. It will be one of the largest single manufacturing efforts in human history, and it must be simple. Every curve, every joint, every rivet is a potential point of failure, a place where production can slow, where quality can degrade. Jarrett's team studies industrial processes, deep draw stamping, spin forming, heat treatment, edge rolling. They visit steel mills in Pittsburgh, stamping plants in Detroit, small machine shops in Ohio and Pennsylvania. They learn which operations can be automated, which require skilled labor, which can be performed by workers with minimal training. A production memo dated August 1942, preserved in the National Archives, shows the scale of the challenge. McCord Radiator Company alone is stamping 14,000 shells per day. Schluter Manufacturing adds another 9,000. Smaller contractors across the Midwest contribute thousands more. The memo concludes with a single underlined sentence: quality must not slip. Every helmet is a life. The final design, designated the M1, is a marvel of economy. The shell is stamped from a single sheet of Hadfield manganese steel, 12-gauge thickness, thin enough to stamp efficiently, thick enough to stop a fragment traveling faster than a rifle bullet, hardened to a Rockwell rating of 50. The shape is parabolic, with a steep frontal slope and pronounced side flares. The brim is narrow, just enough to shed rain, not so wide as to catch on obstacles. At the rear, a subtle ridge runs down the center line, a structural reinforcement that also serves as a drainage channel. The entire shell weighs 2.5 pounds, but the M1 is not a single helmet. It is two. Beneath the steel shell sits a liner, a separate helmet made from compressed canvas and resin, molded into the same parabolic shape. The liner is held in place by an adjustable webbing suspension system, a cradle of cotton straps that keeps the shell floating a half-inch above the wearer's skull. This air gap is critical. When a fragment strikes the steel, its kinetic energy is dissipated through deformation of the shell. If the shell were pressed directly against the skull, that energy would transfer inward, causing blunt trauma even if the steel held. The air gap absorbs the shock. The liner flexes. The soldier survives. In testing, the M1 stops 95% of shrapnel fragments traveling at 1,500 feet per second. It stops 70% at 1,800. Against direct small arms fire, it is less reliable. Pistol rounds at close range can penetrate. Rifle rounds almost always do. But shrapnel, not bullets, is the primary killer on modern battlefields. The M1 is optimized for the threat that matters most. Production begins in June 1941. By December, when Japanese bombs fall on Pearl Harbor, over 300,000 M1 helmets have been manufactured. By the end of 1942, the number exceeds 5 million. By war's end, it will be 22 million, each one identical, each one tested, each one a promise stamped in steel. The men who wear the M1 do not know its history. They do not know about Aberdeen, about Jarrett's sketches, about the ballistic gelatin or the photographic plates. They know only that the helmet is heavy, that it digs into the forehead if the chin strap is too tight, that it clangs like a bell when struck. They use it as a wash basin, a cooking pot, a seat, a shovel. They curse it in 100 languages and 1,000 dialects, but they wear it. Always. Because the stories circulate. Stories of men who lived because a fragment glanced off the steel. Stories of helmets dented so deeply, the wearer suffered a concussion but lived. Stories of helmets pierced clean through, but at such an angle that the fragment missed the skull entirely. Private First Class Robert Leckie, who would later write of his experiences on Guadalcanal, described the moment a Japanese grenade detonated 3 feet from his foxhole. He wrote, "The helmet rang like a cathedral bell. My vision went white. I thought my head had been torn off. But when the ringing stopped and the smoke cleared, I put my hand to my scalp and felt no blood. Just the helmet, dented deep enough to touch my skull through the liner, hot enough to burn my fingers. I wore it for 3 more months." There is a photograph, taken somewhere in France in late 1944. It shows a young infantryman, face streaked with dirt, eyes distant. His helmet is still on his head, but there is a hole in it the size of a quarter, punched through the left side just above the temple. The metal is peeled back in ragged petals. The photograph is labeled, "Survived." The fragment, probably a piece of an 80mm shell, struck at a steep angle, penetrated the steel, but was deflected by the curve of the dome just enough to pass behind the man's skull rather than through it. He lost hearing in one ear. He lived, the Germans notice. Prisoners interrogated in North Africa, Italy, and France remark on the American helmet. It is better than theirs, they say. Lighter, more protective at the sides. Some German soldiers begin wearing captured M1s in preference to their own Stahlhelms, a fact that causes no small amount of confusion on both sides. A sergeant in the 101st Airborne recounts shooting at a figure in an M1 only to discover, upon approach, that the dead man wore Feldgrau and spoke no English. The sergeant's after-action report notes, with bitter irony, "They know good equipment when they see it." The Japanese, too, notice. Their own helmets, Type 90s and Type 92s, are shallow, ill-fitting, stamped from mediocre steel. They provide minimal protection. Japanese soldiers captured on Guadalcanal, Saipan, Iwo Jima speak of the American helmet with something approaching awe. It is a symbol, they say, of industrial might, of a nation that can afford to armor every soldier's head with steel that would, in Japan, be reserved for warship plating. One prisoner, interrogated on Okinawa in May 1945, told his captors, "We were told America was weak, that you valued comfort over sacrifice. But you come to this island wearing better armor than our best troops. What else were we told that was a lie?" And that is the deeper truth the M1 represents. It is not merely a piece of equipment. It is a statement. It says, "We value you. We have spent the steel, the labor, the engineering talent to protect your skull because you matter." In armies where men are told they are expendable, where officers regard casualties as statistics, this is unthinkable. The Japanese soldier is issued a helmet as an afterthought, a token gesture toward survival. The German soldier receives excellent equipment, but in ever-diminishing quantities as the war drags on, as factories are bombed and steel is diverted to tanks, to aircraft, to submarines. The American soldier receives the M1, 22 million of them, each one engineered to the same exacting standard, each one a small promise. You are not expendable. You are not a number. Come home. But the M1 is more than symbol. It is physics made manifest, geometry turned to purpose. Its success lies in the elegant application of a simple principle. Angles deflect force. A fragment traveling at 1,500 feet per second carries lethal energy, but that energy can be redirected. A steep curve does what flat steel cannot. It turns the blow aside, transforms penetration into glancing impact. The M1's parabolic dome ensures that no matter the angle of attack, the fragment strikes a surface sloped steeply enough to deflect. There are dead zones, the very top of the crown, where the curve flattens, but they are small, and fragments approaching from directly above are rare. Most shrapnel comes laterally, from shell bursts at ground level or slightly above. The M1's geometry is optimized for this reality. The liner system, too, is inspired. Early helmets, British, French, German, used leather straps or cork padding pressed directly against the shell. These systems were uncomfortable, unhygienic, and ineffective at distributing impact forces. The M1's suspended liner, by contrast, cradles the head without touching the shell. The webbing absorbs shock. The air gap prevents heat transfer in summer, cold transfer in winter. The liner itself, made from laminated canvas impregnated with phenolic resin, is lightweight and durable. It can be removed, cleaned, replaced. Soldiers quickly discover that the liner alone, worn without the steel shell, offers some protection against glancing blows and is far more comfortable during extended periods in rear areas. This dual functionality, the liner as a separate, usable helmet, is not originally intended, but it becomes standard practice. In the Pacific, where heat and humidity are constant, the M1 proves its worth in unexpected ways. The steel shell reflects sunlight, reducing heat buildup. The liner's ventilation holes allow airflow. Soldiers stuff the gap between liner and shell with camouflage netting, foliage, cigarette packs, letters from home. The helmet becomes a personal space, a small assertion of individuality in a landscape of uniform sameness. Some men paint slogans, names, unit insignia. Others leave it bare, the steel dulled with mud or soap to prevent glare. Either way, it is theirs. In Europe, the M1 endures cold that turns steel brittle, rain that rusts it, mud that clogs the chin strap rivets. It is dropped from aircraft, run over by tanks, buried in rubble and dug out again. It is struck by bullets, shrapnel, debris, and still it holds. Not always. Nothing holds always, but often enough that men come to trust it, to rely on it, to feel naked without it. There is a story, perhaps apocryphal but repeated often enough to have weight, of a soldier in the Ardennes who used his helmet to shield his face during an artillery barrage. A shell fragment struck the upturned dome and was deflected downward into the snow. The soldier survived without injury. When asked why he held the helmet in front of his face rather than wearing it, he replied that he had been lying flat and wanted to protect his eyes. The detail that makes the story resonate is this: the helmet worked even when used incorrectly. Its geometry was so effective that even inverted, even held at an awkward angle, it deflected the fragment. This is the mark of good design. It functions despite misuse. Technical reports filed by medical officers in the European theater document the M1's effectiveness with clinical precision. A study conducted in December 1944 analyzed 500 head wounds treated at field hospitals behind the front lines. Of these, 312 involved soldiers wearing the M1. 78% survived. Of the 188 soldiers not wearing helmets at the time of injury, men caught in rear areas, men who had removed them briefly, men whose helmets had been blown off, only 31% survived. The report's conclusion is stark. The M1 helmet represents the single most effective piece of personal protective equipment issued to American forces. Its contribution to survival rates cannot be overstated. The engineers who designed the M1 did not live to see its full legacy. Major Jarrett retired after the war, his notebooks archived, his contributions largely forgotten outside specialist circles. The industrial designers, the metallurgists, the production managers, most remained anonymous, their work subsumed into the vast machinery of wartime manufacturing. But their creation outlived them. The M1 remained the standard U.S. military helmet for 4 decades, seeing service in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond. It was copied, modified, adapted by dozens of nations. Its basic design, parabolic dome, suspended liner, dual-layer construction, became the template for modern combat helmets. Today's advanced composite helmets, made from Kevlar and carbon fiber, still echo the M1's geometry, still rely on its core principle. Angles deflect force. What the German soldiers expected when they first faced American forces in North Africa was an enemy equipped much like themselves, well-armed but finite, constrained by the same material limitations that bound every modern army. What they encountered instead was abundance made tactical. The Americans had helmets for everyone. They had spare helmets. They had helmets in depots, helmets in warehouses, helmets stacked in crates waiting to be shipped forward. And each helmet was good. Not perfect, but good enough. Engineered well enough. Produced in such quantity that loss was irrelevant. A German soldier who lost his Stahlhelm might wait weeks for a replacement. An American who lost his M1 was issued another the same day. This was demoralizing in a way that transcended tactics. It spoke to a deeper imbalance, an asymmetry not of courage or skill, but of capacity. The Americans could afford to armor every head because they had the steel, the factories, the organizational systems to do so. The Germans, for all their vaunted engineering, could not. Neither could the Japanese. Neither could the Italians. By 1944, even the British were supplementing their own production with American-made helmets. Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, inspecting American units before D-Day, reportedly examined an M1 and remarked to his aide, "If we had 1 million of these 2 years ago, we might have saved 10,000 men." And the men who wore the M1 felt this. They might not have articulated it clearly, might not have understood the economics or the logistics, but they knew. They knew that somewhere behind them, far behind, across an ocean, there were factories running 3 shifts a day, pouring steel, stamping shells, assembling liners. They knew that their lives had been considered, calculated, valued enough to justify the expense. This knowledge, intangible as it was, became part of the helmet's protection. It was not just steel on their heads. It was assurance. It was proof that someone, somewhere, believed they deserved to come home. Consider the fragment. It is born in fire, in the explosive disintegration of a shell casing, a bomb, a grenade. It is irregular, tumbling, its trajectory chaotic. It weighs perhaps an ounce, perhaps less. It is not aimed. It has no purpose. It is simply force-made solid, energy-seeking release. It travels faster than sound, slower than a bullet, and it is everywhere. Shrapnel accounts for 70% of battlefield casualties in World War II. It is the signature wound of modern war, the unseen reaper that cuts men down without warning, without mercy, without meaning. The fragment does not care about ideology. It does not distinguish between American and German, Japanese and British. It strikes whoever is near when the shell detonates. But the helmet cares. The helmet is ideology made steel. It is the idea that life is worth preserving, that the individual soldier is valuable, that survival is not merely acceptable but expected. Totalitarian armies regard casualties as inevitable, even necessary. Blood sacrifice for the state, the Führer, the Emperor. Democratic armies regard them as failures to be minimized, tragedies to be prevented. The M1 is the physical manifestation of this difference. When the fragment strikes the M1, it does so at an angle determined by chance, 15 degrees, 30, 45. The steeper the angle, the more likely the fragment will skip off rather than penetrate. The M1's geometry maximizes this probability. The fragment, traveling at 1,500 feet per second, contacts the hardened manganese steel for a fraction of a millisecond. In that instant, forces collide. The kinetic energy of the fragment against the tensile strength of the steel. The angle of incidence against the curve of the dome. If the angle is steep enough, if the steel is hard enough, the fragment glances away. It tumbles off into the air, its energy spent, its lethality negated. The helmet rings like a struck bell. The soldier beneath it feels the impact, a sharp concussive blow transmitted through the liner and webbing. His ears ring, his neck snaps back, but his skull is intact. He lives. This transaction, fragment to steel, force to geometry, occurs thousands of times every day across every theater of the war. Most are never recorded. Most pass without witness, but they accumulate. They add up. Men who would have died instead live. They continue fighting, or they are evacuated, or they recover and return. The arithmetic of survival shifts imperceptibly, but inexorably. By the end of the war, it is estimated that the M1 prevented between 70 and 90,000 fatal head wounds. 70 to 90,000 men who walked off battlefields, who boarded ships home, who saw their children born, who grew old. All because a curve of steel caught a fragment and turned it aside. And the helmet itself bears witness. Each dent, each scrape, each penetration that did not quite penetrate becomes a record. After the war, helmets are collected, catalogued, studied. Patterns emerge. Most impacts occur at the temple, the side, the rear, exactly where the old Brody had been weakest. Most fragments strike at oblique angles, confirming the importance of the M1's steep dome. A small percentage of helmets show multiple impacts, evidence that some men were extraordinarily unlucky or extraordinarily exposed. A few show penetrations that should have been fatal, but were not. The fragment deflected by some microscopic irregularity in the steel. Some unintended consequence of the stamping process that turned a killing blow into a survivable wound. These helmets are not melted down. They are kept, preserved, studied. They are data. They are proof. They are evidence that design matters, that engineering saves lives, that the curve of a dome and the thickness of steel can stand between a man and oblivion. There is a photograph taken in the spring of 1945, somewhere in Germany. It shows a pile of discarded helmets, German Stahlhelms, hundreds of them, stacked haphazardly beside a road. They have been abandoned by soldiers who no longer need them, soldiers who have surrendered or fled or died. Among the pile, half buried, is a single M1. It is dented, scratched, caked with dried mud. The chin strap is frayed, the liner is missing, but it is recognizable, unmistakable, even in ruin. The photograph is not symbolic in any planned way. It was not staged. The photographer, an unknown Signal Corps enlisted man, simply found the scene and recorded it. But the image carries weight nonetheless. The M1, alone among the German helmets, speaks to presence, to the fact of American soldiers having passed this way, having fought here, having survived here. It is a marker, a gravestone in reverse, proof not of death but of persistence. By May 1945, the war in Europe is over. By August, the war in the Pacific ends. The soldiers come home and they bring their helmets with them. Some are kept as souvenirs, stashed in attics and basements, pulled out years later to show children and grandchildren. Others are turned in, returned to army depots, cleaned and refurbished and stored for future use. Still others are left behind, in foxholes, in abandoned camps, in fields and forests across Europe and the Pacific. They rust, slowly, becoming part of the landscape, fragments of steel returning to the earth that forged them. But the M1's legacy is not in the steel itself. It is in the principle it embodies, that survival is a design problem, that lives can be saved through thought and effort and the careful application of geometry. The engineers who created the M1 understood something profound, that war is not merely a contest of will, but a contest of systems, and that the side with better systems, better logistics, better production, better equipment, will prevail, all else being equal. The M1 helmet did not win the war. No single piece of equipment wins wars, but it saved tens of thousands of lives, perhaps hundreds of thousands. It allowed men to return home who otherwise would not have. It turned fatal wounds into survivable ones, penetrating impacts into glancing blows. It did this not through magic, not through luck, but through design, through the deliberate, thoughtful arrangement of steel and space, curve and angle, material and geometry. And in this, it is a monument, not to war, but to the idea that war's costs can be mitigated, that death is not inevitable, that human ingenuity can be turned toward preservation as easily as toward destruction. The M1 is proof that the same mind capable of designing artillery shells can also design the helmet that stops them, that the same industrial capacity that produces bombers can also produce the armor that protects against bombs. This is the quiet truth at the heart of the M1 story, that even in the midst of history's most destructive conflict, there were men who chose to build something that saved lives rather than took them, who spent their time and talent not on perfecting weapons but on perfecting shields. They did not do this out of sentimentality. They did it because it was practical, necessary, achievable. They did it because the mathematics of deflection and the metallurgy of hardened steel were problems that could be solved, and solving them meant that men who wore the result might see home again. The fragment does not stop. It will always be born in fire, always travel at lethal speed, always seek its mark. But the helmet stands in the way, and sometimes, often enough to matter, often enough to justify every hour spent in testing ranges, every ton of steel diverted from tanks and ships, every dollar spent on research. It turns the fragment aside. The soldier beneath it feels the blow, hears the ring of struck steel, touches his head in disbelief, and continues forward. He does not think of engineers or testing ranges or parabolic geometry. He thinks only of survival, of the next step, the next objective, the next day. He thinks of home, but survival is not accident. It is design, and the M1, humble and dented and mud-streaked, is proof that design endures, that thoughtfulness persists, that even in chaos, Someone cared enough to bend steel into the shape of protection. This is what the helmet whispers, in its silence, in the weight of it pressing down on tired shoulders, in the way it catches rain and turns it away from the eyes. You were worth saving. You are still worth saving. We spent the steel. We did the mathematics. We built this for you. Keep moving. Stay low. Come home. And so they did. Millions of them, wearing steel shaped to save them, angles calculated to deflect death. A helmet born from the knowledge that every life, even in war, especially in war, is worth the weight of metal it takes to preserve it. They came home to children who never knew how close they came to not existing, to wives who never learned the geometry that saved their husbands, to parents who wept with relief and never thought to thank the engineers who made that relief possible. The M1 asks nothing. It offers everything. It is the promise, kept, that democracy makes to those who defend it. You matter. Your life has value. We will protect you as you protect us. And in the end, that promise, stamped in steel, curved to deflection, suspended above the skull by cotton webbing and phenolic resin, is worth more than all the tanks and bombers and battleships combined. Because it says that even in war, even in the worst of human behavior, there is still room for humanity. There is still space for the idea that one life saved is worth any effort, any cost, any amount of steel bent to purpose. The M1 helmet stopped shrapnel at any angle. But what it really stopped was despair. The despair that war makes men worthless, that survival is only luck, that no one cares if you come home. It stopped that lie, and in doing so, it became something more than equipment. It became faith, made tangible that someone, somewhere, was working to bring you home alive.